What is signing and closing in reference to the mergers and acquisitions? While signing refers to agreeing on the terms and conditions, closing represents the actual act of selling the shares or the asset. So between the signing and closing, the so-called closing conditions are due in order for a successful completion of the deal. Only when the conditions are fulfilled, the ownership of the share can transfer from the seller to the buyer. So it is rarely possible to prevent a gap between the signing and closing, which can last from a few days to a several months in complex cases. So due to uncertainty for both the parties, the time interval between signing and closing should be as short as possible. Moreover, the agreed upon rights of withdrawal and requirements to execution must be kept to a minimum. The entitlement to the profit passed by the buyers either retrospectively at a point of time before signing or at the time of closing, it depends upon the mechanism which is used. So basically, closing condition are conditions which require to be complied before the closing of transaction. For drafting a closing condition to merger and acquisition agreement, all the possible open ends existing before the closing of the transaction must be listed under the closing condition. The closing condition may include the representation and warranties declared by the seller that are valid until the closing date, the representation and warranties declared by the buyer that are valid until the closing date. All the governmental and regulatory approval are in place or when it is intended to be obtained. Failure by any party to comply with the closing condition may lead to renegotiation of a deal or may result in dispute or may lead to termination of agreement. What is the closing mechanism in case of acquisition? Everything depends on the intention of the parties. Generally, in a transaction, closing is subject to fulfillment of certain formalities or the events which may be set as condition precedent as required by the buyer or the seller. So the parties to transaction, they can organize the closing in the manner which is convenient to them. So equally, there may be certain condition which is agreed upon as the condition subsequent to the closing. How much gap should be there between signing and closing of transaction? So there is no any prescribed mandatory gap between signing and closing. It all depends upon the modalities of each transaction.